75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47. It's at the very bottom of the ballot. They hear socialist, they think herpes, Bernie. We have to get
But then the Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion. I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely right. All right.
But that's socialism, the military. That's crony socialism.
Well, that's
right.
Crony capitalism.
But the military isn't capitalism. That's the government.
No, but it's who owns the military industrial complexes. All right. But anyhow.
Right.
Bill Maher has just unloaded on Bernie Sanders in a brutal on-air takedown on live TV. Sanders has been dominating headlines with his hardline socialist push, and Maher is not holding back. The critique is sharp, relentless, and goes straight at the core of Sanders' agenda. So make sure you subscribe, and let's get right into it.
When he ran in 2020, Bernie Sanders said he would legalize marijuana on his first day as president, but that the business of selling pot would be awarded first to those who suffered most from the drug war. And you know what? I can't argue with that instinct. The drug war has been a horrendous instrument of prejudice and punishment for racial minorities. So it seems fair that they jump the line for weed franchises the way Indians did for casinos. But it's also what's holding up Republican support for legalizing weed nationally, which would be good for everybody. And these are the hard, practical choices the Democrats have to weigh. Redress the past, or reach out to the gettable white voter who says, you know what, I'd like a shot at getting in the pot business.
Here, Bill Maher isn't actually attacking Bernie Sanders for proposing marijuana legalization if he ever becomes president. He's going after the strategy behind it. Sanders' reported plan to prioritize Latinos for early access to cannabis business ownership has triggered backlash, especially from Republicans who see it as reckless and politically charged. Critics argue it could create unintended consequences or fuel illegal markets. Whether that's true or not, Maher's point goes deeper. He's mocking what he sees as identity-driven policymaking replacing practical decisions. Instead of doubling down on a controversial rollout, Maher suggests moving toward a broader, more neutral approach, one that avoids racial preferences entirely, even floating the idea of extending opportunities to white farmers. In the end, Maher isn't prescribing policy. He's highlighting what he sees as the absurdity of choosing winners based on identity instead of competence or fairness.
For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor fuck in the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists. And that's a very different thing. And I don't think people know that yet.
Bill Maher then shifts focus and zeroes in on Bernie Sanders' push for a single-payer healthcare system. And he doesn't hold back. Maher mocks the idea with a sharp, almost incredulous tone, pointing to its troubled history in Vermont, a deeply liberal state that should have been the perfect testing ground. Despite its smaller population and political alignment, the plan ultimately collapsed under financial pressure and logistical challenges. For Maher, that failure isn't a footnote. It's the central argument. He frames it as a warning sign, questioning how a policy that struggled in a controlled, supportive environment could ever scale across a nation as large and complex as the United States. The point lands hard, reinforcing his broader critique that sweeping socialist promises may sound strong in theory, but tend to break down under real-world economics and implementation.
Suggesting if we move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program, which guarantees health care to all people, it would cost a lot of money. That's true. But what they forget to tell you is it would be much more cost effective than the dysfunctional system we have right now, which is the most expensive per capita on earth.
But it couldn't even work in your home state of Vermont. They were going to institute it, and the governor said, it's going to cost too much money. We just can't do it. It would be the entire budget.
No, well,
that's true.
Well, I'm not the governor of the state of Vermont. I'm the senator from the state of Vermont.
This is where critics say the argument becomes difficult to defend. Vermont, a small progressive state and essentially Bernie Sanders' political backyard, once explored a single-payer healthcare system, only to abandon it after concluding the costs would far exceed its existing setup. For many skeptics, that moment still stands as a clear contradiction. If a state with a relatively small population and strong liberal support couldn't make it work, they ask, how could it realistically scale to the entire United States? That's the question critics continue to raise. Sanders still presents single-payer healthcare as a cost-effective long-term solution, but opponents point to Vermont's experience as evidence that the math doesn't always hold up. To them, it's more than a policy debate. It's a real-world example that raises serious doubts about whether sweeping reforms can deliver.
Then the question is, Bill, you tell me, why is it that every other major country on earth,
I will tell you why. Because they control both ends of it. If you're saying that the government is going to pick up the tab, but not make the insurance companies, the hospitals, and the doctors not gouge people,
right,
then we are going to break the budget. It has to work both ways.
Exactly.
Okay, so then
here's an example.
So you're going to make the hospitals do that? Because that is
the United States is the only major country on earth that allows private insurance companies to make huge profits in the healthcare system.
Right.
The function of healthcare should be to provide quality care to all people, not to make huge profits of the drug companies.
And that leads to one of the toughest questions surrounding any universal healthcare system. Even if the government guarantees coverage, can it realistically stop private hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and healthcare providers from pushing for higher profits? Bill Maher argues that without strict cost controls and enforcement, providers could inflate prices, overbill services, or recommend unnecessary treatments, driving costs far beyond expectations. In that situation, what starts as an effort to reduce financial pressure could turn into a bloated, inefficient system that costs even more than the current one. Governments would then face difficult choices: raise taxes, cut services, or impose tighter regulations that could limit access or quality. The concern isn't theoretical, it's about incentives. If the structure isn't carefully designed, the system meant to lower costs could end up increasing them, putting an even heavier burden on taxpayers.
The DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election on that? This just seems like more extremism at a time when Americans are begging both parties, please, could just one of you act normal?
Bill Maher then turns his attention to what he describes as Bernie Sanders' more permissive stance on immigration, criticizing what he sees as a more open approach. Maher leans into concerns many Americans already debate, arguing there may be issues with enforcement and oversight. He points to examples critics often highlight: asylum claims filed with little documentation, visa overstays that bypass the system, and sanctuary policies that limit deportation after minor offenses. Maher's argument, however, isn't that immigration itself is the problem. Instead, he frames it as a question of structure and control. In his view, a country needs clear rules, consistent enforcement, and a system that prioritizes fairness for both citizens and legal entrants. Without that balance, he argues, the system becomes harder to manage and risks weakening public trust instead of strengthening the nation.
Either defund the police or military in the streets. Either MAGA's crypto crony capitalism or city-run grocery stores. No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods. Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal. You know, at this year's DSA convention, or as it's commonly known, Comic-Con, get this, you had to submit a photo of a negative COVID test to get in. In 2025. Yeah, no one wants to do that shit again.
Bill Maher argues that Bernie Sanders' embrace of what he calls more extreme ideological positions continues to hold him back politically. In Maher's view, Sanders doesn't just face opposition from Republicans, he also faces skepticism within his own party. Many Democrats, he suggests, see his platform as too rigid and too risky to win a national election. Maher points to Sanders' socialist-leaning policies as a key issue, arguing they fail to connect with a broader group of voters who may lean left but still prefer more moderate, practical solutions. Even among Democrats, Maher claims there is growing fatigue with messaging that feels more ideological than realistic. The result, he argues, is a candidate who energizes a strong base but struggles to expand beyond it, raising serious concerns about his ability to unify the party and compete nationally.
We want to deal with the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality in America. Very few people think it is acceptable or moral that the top 0.1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That we have seen a proliferate.
But see, Bernie, you always say that, and I think even the Republicans are not for income inequality. They hear that, but it doesn't compute that that's going to be solved by socialism. Socialism is the programs they already like. They like Social Security. That's socialism. But they like Medicare. They like the VA. They like the military.
No, that's exactly right.
Bill Maher's point is that the United States already operates with a mix of social safety nets without fully adopting socialism. Programs like Social Security, Medicaid, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and food assistance already provide support for millions of Americans. In fact, programs like Medicaid alone serve as a major healthcare source for low-income populations. Maher's broader argument is that expanding these targeted systems is very different from restructuring the entire economy into a fully socialist model. Critics of full-scale socialism often point to countries like Venezuela and North Korea as cautionary examples, arguing that heavy state control can lead to economic decline, shortages, and reduced opportunity. For Maher, the message is clear: strengthen what works, fix what doesn't, but don't risk the entire system.
Like 75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47. It's at the very bottom of the barrel. They hear socialist, they think herpes, Bernie. We have to get this.
Many Americans remain skeptical of socialism for a simple reason. They believe it doesn't work in practice. On paper, it sounds appealing: fairness, equality, and the promise that basic needs will be met. But critics argue reality often looks different. When governments take heavy control over industries, it can lead to inefficiency, less innovation, and fewer incentives to work or invest. Over time, that can mean slower growth, job shortages, and declining productivity. There's also the issue of control. The idea of free goods loses appeal when distribution is tightly regulated. People worry about officials deciding what's available, how much they receive, and when they receive it. That level of central planning can lead to shortages, long waits, and limited options. For many Americans, it's not about rejecting support. It's about avoiding a system that could trade freedom and opportunity for rigid control.
Right.
Should the American people believe that the largest corporations and the wealthiest people who today are doing phenomenally well while the middle class shrinks, do people believe they should be asked to pay more in taxes? The American people say yes.
Okay. But now this has been studied. The amount of tax revenue that we would get just from taxing the people who I think your fans think you're talking about, the people who own a yacht, does not come close to covering what you want to pay for.
And that's the core of the argument. Simply calling for higher taxes on the wealthy doesn't automatically fix deeper economic problems. Critics say the real issue isn't just how much revenue is collected, but how effectively it's managed and spent. Billions of taxpayer dollars have already moved through federal and state budgets, yet concerns about waste and inefficiency remain. Projects like California's high-speed rail have seen costs surge into the tens of billions with limited progress. Boston's Big Dig ran far over budget and years behind schedule. There are also federal programs flagged for improper payments, with billions lost annually to errors or fraud. The point critics make is clear: before asking taxpayers for more, governments need to show they can responsibly manage what they already have.
Trump, the Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion. I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely right. All right.
But that's socialism, the military. That's crony socialism.
Well, that's
right.
Crony capitalism.
But the military isn't capitalism. That's the government.
No, but it's who owns the military industrial complexes. All right. But anyhow.
At the center of this debate is practicality versus ideology. Bill Maher argues that many of Bernie Sanders' ambitious proposals, from open borders to single-payer healthcare, may sound appealing but often struggle in real-world conditions. Failures in Vermont, inefficiencies in major projects, and risks of system abuse highlight the challenges of overreach. Americans value support programs, but they also expect accountability, efficiency, and measurable results. Instead of chasing sweeping ideological changes, the focus should be on improving existing systems, managing resources carefully, and implementing policies that strengthen the country without creating unintended consequences. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.